Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our Krasno Global Event on escalating tensions, US-China relations, and the Taiwan question. Today, we have three distinguished guests who will discuss this question with us. As always, the video recording of this event will be uploaded to our famous YouTube channel, that is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. Incidentally, the video about yesterday's event, when Ambassador Jack Matlock talked about the life, politics, and legacy of Mikhail Gorbachev, that video has already been uploaded. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Thank you all for joining us. We have a great international audience today with many people from China, Taiwan, and Asia having joined us. Please submit your questions in writing via the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our two Krasno assistants will select your questions and read them out aloud to all of us. We have three distinguished guests and experts today, as I said. There's Kaiser Kuo. He is editor-at-large of SubChina, which is now called the China Project, and he is the host of the Sinica podcast and the most knowledgeable expert on all things Chinese. We also have Professor Shelley Rigger of Davidson College in North Carolina. Shelley is perhaps America's leading expert on Taiwan and US-Taiwanese relations. And last but not least, I would like to welcome John Culver. John used to work for the National Intelligence Council and for the CIA, and I'm sure he gained many interesting insights by doing so. He has retired from these organizations now and is now a non-residential senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Initially, our three guests will make 8 to 10 minute remarks about how they see the current situation in the Taiwan Strait. I will then ask them a number of hopefully challenging questions. Subsequently, we will open it up to questions from you, the audience. Please submit your many questions in writing, as I said, via the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Please don't hesitate to do so. We are greatly looking forward to your questions. Once again, I would like to thank our three distinguished guests for joining us today. Perhaps we'll start with Kaiser Kuo of the China Project and Sinica podcasts. Kaiser, would you like to make your short initial remarks, please?
Sure. Thanks so much, Klaus, for inviting me to be part of this. And it's a real delight to have Shelley Rigger and John Culver, who are two people who I respect enormously and who are extraordinarily knowledgeable about this topic and many others, and to have them here in Chapel Hill, if only virtually. So Taiwan is, of course, the mother of all US-China issues. I should note at the top that it is not just a US-China issue. We were talking about a prosperous and in many, many ways, a very admirable society of 25 million souls with their own agency and their own priorities and their own aspirations. I think it's very important to recognize that it's too often Taiwan is just kind of a chew toy in great power competition, and that is truly lamentable. But Klaus did ask me to talk specifically about Taiwan in the US-China relationship. So in the remarks that follow, if it does feel like I'm ignoring Taiwanese voices in this, it's only because of the topic assigned. But it is a huge issue, the central issue, I think most would say, in US-China relations, the most likely flashpoint, to be sure, for any conflict, an issue that is regarded rightly or wrongly as one of vital strategic, that is to say national security importance by both China and the US. It's an economic choke point for its preponderance in manufacturing the advanced semiconductors that really power modern economies, not just of the US and China, but really of the entire industrialized world. Even within the United States, it really sets two important facets of our own national character, our own character as Americans, against each other. On the one hand, there is our emotional commitment and our ideological commitment to democracy, our cultural propensity, I think, to root for the underdog. We do that. And let's face it, our deep abiding, but mostly unspoken psychological discomfiture at China's rise. And on the other hand, there's our at least notional commitment to honor what we said we would do and to continue to commit to the one China policy and neither condone nor encourage de facto or de jure rather Taiwanese independence, a commitment that both originates in and is still buttressed by a certain pragmatism that however grudgingly, recognizes, the sheer size of the PRC, which is just a huge slice of humanity, as well as its economic heft, the seriousness of the conviction when it comes to Taiwan that Chinese people and Chinese leaders especially hold, and ultimately the abiding importance of avoiding conflict with China first and foremost. So we have this, emotional and sort of maybe sober intellectual commitments that butt up against one another. When we look at the U.S. and China and their positions when it comes to Taiwan, we see other fundamental, and you might even say philosophical issues in play and at odds. Both Beijing and the U.S., so the supporters of Taiwan's independence in the US, they appeal to this idea of sovereignty and national self-determination. But the way that these two ideas are applied is radically, diametrically different, of course. Increasingly, Americans, including many lawmakers, frame the issue simply as one of a people with an increasingly distinct and separate sense of ethnic and political identity, as having, and as they should, a fundamental right to national self-determination. That seems simple enough, right? But China also sees things in terms of sovereignty. It believes that a piece of Chinese territory recognized as part of the Republic of China remained separate and was not absorbed by the People's Republic only because of direct American intervention in the 1950s during the Civil War. It pits, I think, in a Chinese understanding which is perhaps overly burdened by and too firmly tethered to history, against an American understanding, which is perhaps insufficiently burdened by and maybe too often totally untethered from history. So China might well be criticized for nurturing and for continuing to give oxygen to historical grievances, to the century of humiliation through, patriotic education and other propaganda. But we Americans are, as a nation, I think, also deserving of criticism for our often smug and dismissive ahistoricism and our total willful ignorance of history and its contingent nature and its demands on other people. I don't think it requires particularly formidable powers of imagination for us to be able to grasp how all that we have done lately on Taiwan must look from Beijing, does look from Beijing through the eyes of not just Beijing's leaders, but of ordinary people as well, beginning with then President-elect Trump's telephone call with Tsai Ing-wen in December of 2016. We've seen what China would see as accelerating moves by the US to break faith with what China has always understood as the status quo, a problematic idea that we'll talk about later, but increasing transits of the Taiwan Straits, visits by congressional delegations, of course, subtle and not so subtle changes in language, supposed gaffes, 3 of them now, so maybe they're not gaffes by Joe Biden on the question of US military intervention on behalf of Taiwan. And all of this leading up to the Pelosi visit. In their mind, as with so many other issues with China right now, they're convinced that the American fixation with Taiwan, as they might describe it, owes more really to this desire to thwart China, to keep China down, to contain China, to box China in, than it does to any genuine concern for the people of Taiwan or their political future. It really shouldn't be hard for anyone to see what things look like from China, to imagine what we Americans look like right now. My kids might use the word salty. We're worked up because of a perceived relative decline, a kind of creeping knowledge that our day in the sun, our reign as the untrammeled, global hegemon is coming to an end. And you know what? I think that they may not be entirely wrong. I mean, it would be actually pretty hard for anyone to convince me otherwise. There isn't some of that in the mix, that it's kind of priming us, I think, to magnify any and all issues that we have with China to see as egregious, even relatively minor, transgressions by China. At the same time, China's own leadership, its diplomats, its media elites, they all seem equally unable to see what the PRC's behavior looks like and how galvanizing it is to opinion in America. They've shown very little interest in understanding why American narratives in Taiwan are as they are. They tend to just chalk it up to basic xenophobia born of this abiding fear of being eclipsed by a rising China. Its efforts to keep Taiwan out of the WHO, even as, so much blame was being directed at Beijing during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, its behavior toward countries like Lithuania, over what I think to most observers looked like pretty inconsequential matters, this all helped to reinforce very negative impressions that China was petty and histrionic and bullying. Beijing and its spokespeople, whether in the foreign ministry, these wolf warriors, or in the state-owned media, have indulged plenty of their own ahistoricism too, I should hasten to add. They are highly selective about what historical episodes they want to foreground and which ones they completely and very conveniently ignore. Moreover, Beijing seems unwilling to adjust its approach, even in the face of pretty indisputable evidence that they have failed to win hearts and minds, chiefly that Taiwanese is now overwhelmingly the primary identity for people in Taiwan, becoming more so, that the one country, two systems formula is viewed again by an overwhelming majority as completely non-viable, especially after what we saw in Hong Kong, the protests of 2019 and 2020, and the imposition of the national security law. It hasn't helped for Beijing that so many also of the reporters who covered China for American media outlets are now based in Taipei. This has helped move Taiwan-related issues to center stage, and I would not be at all surprised if already quite sympathetic coverage about the issues has shifted more in that direction because now of where the reporters are, who they talk to day to day, the narratives that they absorb. Effectively expelling these journalists, whether or not it was defensible given the effective, expulsions of Chinese journalists from the US, it has done quite a bit of reputational damage and lost Beijing's support on the Taiwan issue. So I want to just close with a few gems of wisdom from people who are far wiser than me that I think Americans really should keep top of mind when trying to decide how we should move forward on Taiwan. Shelley, who is with us, of course, has once said that we need to remember that not everything bad for China is good for Taiwan, and not everything good for Taiwan is bad for China. We are clearly not taking that to heart yet. Another thing that was said by Richard Bush, I'm told, he recently warned that we are in danger of loving or hugging Taiwan to death. I can't remember, Shelley, if it was loving or hugging, but one of them. Anyway, we're loving them to death. And Paul here, who I've spoken to about the Taiwan issue many times, who was a colleague of John Culver here for many, many years, who has a great new essay out, by the way, in the American Interest, reminds us that Beijing is not looking for reasons to attack Taiwan. It's looking for reasons not to. And it's actually not difficult for us to supply such reasons. We know how to do it. Meanwhile, I am really convinced that much of what the US is doing ostensibly to weaken China or to help Taiwan is actually quite short-sighted and is ultimately at cross purposes with those goals. Taipei has long, for example, counted on a silicon shield, which deters any potential attack from China because, well, China is totally dependent, like so many other countries are, like we are, on advanced semiconductors from Taiwan. If we prevent TSMC, Taiwan's powerhouse advanced semiconductor manufacturer, if we prevent it from exporting its products to China as we want to, what happens? Not only do we basically destroy or weaken, cripple one of Taiwan's core strategic industries, but we also remove a significant disincentive for China to make a move. So we might want to think about the impact on Taiwan also of the CHIPS Act that many of us have spoken approvingly of. Look, no matter what we do, whether it's making Taiwan into an impenetrable hedgehog with defense in depth and the capacity to resist, or whether it's building out our own advanced semiconductor manufacturing capabilities and weaning ourselves off of this dangerous dependence on Hsinchu, or if it's outlasting this last generation that has a living memory of the Civil War, waiting for them to die so that people with much less emotional investment can maybe rethink the issue with a little more detachment. The thing that we need, no matter what, is time. If that means that Taiwan has to suffer relative diplomatic isolation for another couple of decades even, I still think that is massively preferable to having a nominally sovereign smoldering ruin, a global financial meltdown, deaths ranging into the hundreds of thousands, and war with a nuclear superpower.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kaiser. This was very insightful, as always. But I noticed you haven't mentioned the name Nancy Pelosi.
I did
Oh,
briefly.
okay.
I
Well,
did, just at the top.
how damaging was that visit, or wasn't it damaging at all? Will it just be forgotten within a few months?
I think that it was a nail in a coffin. I think that anyone who had any lingering doubt that the United States was intent on hollowing out its policy, that this was sort of the last critical slice of salami that was gone. And I think that we should not dismiss the reaction from Beijing. I think this has shifted things into what I believe is really a fourth Taiwan Straits crisis.
Thank you. And you also mentioned that Biden committed a number of gaffes when he referred to military support for Taiwan. Were these gaffes, or was a military deliberate statement to warn off China?
Yeah, so I have a lot of difficulty believing they were pure gaffes, but then this is Joe Biden we're talking about, so maybe it's not so hard to believe. I don't know. I really don't know. This is one of those questions that I'll ask St. Peter. I really don't know.
Okay. And also you said at the beginning of your talk that you saw the end of the American influence in the Pacific in a way. Is that going to happen? And when would you expect that?
So I don't necessarily see that, but I think that that a lot of Americans have this sense of decline of our influence. I do worry about it. I mean, I think there was right now we're not providing much in the Western Pacific except for security. And as Evan Feigenbaum, a former diplomat who now is at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, he said that Americans now in East Asia are in danger of becoming the Hessians of Asia, that we do nothing or nothing more than just mercenaries, right, which is a depressing reality.
Okay. Thank you very much. We will discuss that further, but let's turn to our next speaker. That is Professor Shelley Rigger of Davidson College, and we can't wait to hear you talk. Shelley, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. And it's kind of both very difficult and also quite nice to follow such a masterful overview. I watched or listened to Kaiser go from the sort of big picture, what is this Taiwan issue? Where does it come from? Through to where does the US PRC Taiwan triangle stand today? So thank you, Kaiser, for setting that up so beautifully and for pulling the audience in with some of that background information that allows us to move forward. So I think what I'll do is to fill in one of the acknowledged lacunae in Kaiser's comments, which is the Taiwanese voice in all of this, right? So the question that it's hard for people not to ask is, what does Taiwan think? As if Taiwan is a monolith with a single brain that thinks anything, right? But I think when people ask that question, what they mean is, what is the central tendency in Taiwan public opinion? And what do we need to know in order to understand whether our actions are aligned with, that is to say, the actions of individuals or organizations in the United States are aligned with the interests and preferences of our Taiwan friends or not? So this is something that is surprisingly difficult to really fully understand. As surprising because Taiwan is just about the most surveyed society in the world. In 2005, I was living in Taipei for a few months, and I actually got called. There was an old landline in the apartment, and I answered the phone, and it was a survey. And I said to the guy, you don't want to ask me survey questions because I'm a foreigner. And he said, no, I've never interviewed a foreigner before. Please answer my questions. Unfortunately, they were mostly about brands of vegetables. So they were not, I didn't get to say my opinion of President Chen Shui-bian at that time or anything like that. But it brought home to me how frequently people in Taiwan are surveyed. And yet, with all of this data out there, it's really hard to know how the wide spectrum of opinion within Taiwan on any issue really breaks down. And in particular, where people are in relation to evolving and emerging events. And so many events are evolving and emerging in the Taiwan Strait at this moment that I think we really don't have a good handle on the sort of central tendencies or the spectrum of views within Taiwan. But I just want to say a little bit about why it's so difficult and what some of the most important observations we can make about Taiwanese public opinion and elite opinion about the current crisis, if we want to call it the fourth Taiwan Strait crisis might be. So one of the questions that is constantly asked of me, especially in Washington, and I'm sure John has heard this question many times, is why are Taiwanese not more anxious about their situation? Right? You know, in the United States, many people are quite convinced that the catastrophe is looming just out of sight for Taiwan, and that if Taiwanese had any sense at all, they'd be in a state of blind panic all the time. And so I'm frequently asked, like, why are they not? I'm freaking out over here. Why are Taiwanese people acting so calm? Why are they, for example, at the height of these tensions over the summer, announcing huge investments in new industrial capacity on the island of Taiwan? TSMC, other semiconductor companies announced big projects in Taiwan right at the most critical moment. So one reason that people in Taiwan do not feel the pressure of their existential situation more acutely, or they don't appear to feel it more acutely, is that it has been going on now for 70 years, right? 70 years of perpetual conflict, low burning, but nonetheless quite evident conflict with the People's Republic of China. They have coexisted with a high level of kind of rhetorical threat. We hear the stuff that Xi Jinping and other PRC leaders say today, and we say, wow, that's really scary. But go back and read some of the things that Mao Zedong and other leaders said in the 1950s about liberating Taiwan by force and throwing out, the American imperialists. This is not a new experience for Taiwanese to live under a sense of threat. So it started to feel like, there's up in the ceiling of the temple, there's an old sword, and it has been up there so long, it's completely crusted over with incense, ash, and dirt and dust and spider webs and all this stuff that's up there. And you don't even notice it anymore. You just, it's up there, but you live under it relatively unaffected. However, I would agree with Kaiser that we are in a new situation as of the last month to 2 months. It's as, in a cartoon or in a movie, that you would watch the threads that are holding that sword up into the ceiling of the temple kind of fraying, and it dropped a couple of inches and it's still hanging up there. It hasn't fallen, but the ash got knocked off by the jolt, and we can see that blade is still plenty sharp, maybe sharper than it was when it got up there 70 years ago. So there is a new situation. My assessment of what has happened over the period, especially since the Pelosi visit, is that the level of PRC readiness and willingness to act upon its dissatisfaction with what the US is doing has kind of ratcheted up, taken a significant step up, and will not ratchet all the way back down. We've had sort of the needle has gone up on the dial before, but it usually comes back down. I think we're sticking at a high level of tension this time. So Taiwanese need to come to terms with the possibility that the catastrophe actually is closer than they realized. And I think there is some evidence to suggest that they are. We don't see it in most of our media coverage. When we listen to the statements by Taiwanese leaders, for example, speeches that President Tsai Ing-wen made around the time of the Pelosi visit, they are very enthusiastic, they are very supportive. The Taiwanese government is certainly trying to put a good face on everything that is happening, but anecdotally, in my interactions with people in and from Taiwan, there is a gathering sense of the situation is headed in the wrong direction, and it causes them to react or to be particularly sensitive and reactive on two questions. One is, will the PRC actually attack Taiwan? So there's a debate in Taiwan that has always existed at a kind of much more low level that is now a more active debate. Will the PRC actually use military force to achieve its objective of annexing Taiwan to the People's Republic of China? And if it does, is Taiwan capable of defending itself? And then there's another debate, which is actually, I think, even more out there in public, which is, what will the US do? Will the US defend Taiwan or not? And here's where I want to at least propose the hypothesis that actions US officials have taken recently are counterproductive. Because if you ask, or if you go back and you listen to her press conferences, Speaker Pelosi, what was your intention in going to Taiwan? It was to give Taiwanese people confidence that we will defend Taiwan. If you ask the Biden administration, why are you sending these messages? Same thing. We want to make Taiwanese people more confident. But I think many Taiwanese are asking themselves, is the US doing these things? Is the US escalating its competition with the PRC? Is the US signaling in its actions toward Taiwan that it is committed to Taiwan and the defense of Taiwan? Or is the signal, we are determined to tweak Beijing, to show toughness to Beijing, to push back on Beijing, and Taiwan is just a kind of convenient tool for doing that? And people in Taiwan are not stupid. They recognize that if all you are is a tool, there is no reason to expect that you are going to be defended should that requirement or that occasion finally arise. So, I'm sort of wondering whether the message that folks in Taiwan are beginning to get is that, this isn't about us at all. This is about the US and the PRC. This is about US domestic politics. So we better watch out, because if all this is posturing for cameras, either whether the cameras are broadcasting to the United States or to the PRC, then we really are a pawn and anything could happen.
Thank you very much, Shelley. That's very interesting thoughts and very provocative thoughts as well. We will discuss it in a minute. We read in the press that the anti-Chinese sentiments in Taiwan, particularly among the young, are constantly increasing. Do you have an idea how strong still the pro-Chinese sentiment still is in Taiwan, where people are not being drawn into the recent episodes, and where they continue to have a feeling of belonging with China?
I think the idea of belonging with the PRC as a political entity is almost zero in Taiwan. There are people who imagine a unified China, but generally speaking, they are not imagining a Taiwan unified with the PRC. They are imagining a different entity in the mainland, one that is welcoming to Taiwan's democratic institutions. But the idea that Taiwanese are culturally and in terms of their ancestry and heritage connected to China is still very real. What I think most Taiwanese where they differ from the PRC leadership is in equating that culture and heritage with some kind of national identity or citizenship or political identity. And so, 25 years ago, the conversation about whether Taiwan is a Chinese, like a historically Chinese place or not, was very hot in Taiwan. That's not such an interesting debate in Taiwan anymore. What has sort of displaced the idea of constructing a Taiwanese identity that is stripped of its Chinese core is a conviction that what matters is to live in a free and democratic society. So as the PRC becomes less free and more undemocratic, not that it was ever particularly free or democratic to begin with, but as the PRC surveillance state, for example, has intensified, that has increased the alienation and even hostility that many people in Taiwan feel toward the PRC, especially young people who are in many cases interested in China, interested in the mainland, but just can't see themselves there under the Xi Jinping regime. So like under Hu Jintao, yes, they could imagine themselves living, working, studying, whatever in the mainland, but not under the way China is under Xi Jinping.
Thanks very much indeed. And what do the Taiwanese people, I know Taiwanese people is difficult to say, but what does the majority perhaps of the population think about their own military capabilities? Do they believe they can actually defend themselves against an invasion or blockade? And does also the what is happening in Eastern Europe with the Ukraine war influence the Taiwanese thinking themselves?
So this is one of the most disconcerting aspects of, and it feels like a disconnect, because on the one hand, people are not freaking out about the possibility of being attacked by the People's Liberation Army. But on the other hand, most of the surveys that we have would suggest that they do not have high confidence in the ability either of their own military or in the ability of the US to intervene, the ability and willingness of the US to intervene quickly enough and effectively enough to protect them. And this is something that I think where the Ukraine war and something Kaiser said becomes really important. Another factor driving many Taiwanese people's lack of urgency around the military threat for many years was a kind of conviction that I think was widely shared internationally, not just in Taiwan, that the worst kind of war was a relic of the 20th century, that we weren't going to see that anymore. We weren't going to see tanks rolling in. We weren't going to see aerial bombardment of civilians ever again, that's just not what happens in the 21st century. And the Ukraine war has made it very clear that that was wishful thinking, right? 20th century war is back with a vengeance. And now I think it's suddenly very clear that a war in the Taiwan Strait means old women on fire. It means children exploded into bits. It's not just, aerial combat. It's not Top Gun Maverick. And it is a very sobering realization.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed it is. John Culver, over to you. And John is, if you want to give away top secret information to us, feel free, please.
No, thanks. I'm not going to follow certain presidents very much in the press these days. But it's depressing hearing these topics, despite how well they're conveyed by Shelley and by Kaiser. So I'm probably just going to hang a bit more crepe and then try to be optimistic. But it's very hard to be optimistic because the factors, say the three pillars that used to provide stability in this trilateral relationship between the U.S., Taiwan, and China, have all eroded, and they've eroded kind of very quickly, or they were eroding and then it just sort of manifested within the span of 5 or 6 years. It used to be that the great constraint and the great factor promoting stability was a strategic relationship between China and the United States that was built during the Cold War, survived in the post-Cold War because China was too focused on pursuing its own goals, mostly economic development, and because they didn't want the global hegemon, the United States, as they saw us, to put a target on them next. But also because they had leadership in Taiwan, more often than not, that wasn't going to push this issue. Taiwan was, at the time that I started working at CIA, was still under a military dictatorship. It didn't really start to democratize until the late 80s. And now its progress is really remarkable. But that US-China relationship and the need in both Beijing and Washington for stability and even to cooperate in some areas was a real constraint, because in most of the past crises, like in the mid-90s and then tension in the 2000s, it was the US that constrained what was seen as pro-independence sentiment on Taiwan, that used to indirectly vet Taiwan politicians who were going to be running for the highest office in that country. And would clearly signal, like in the Obama administration, the first time that Tsai Ing-wen ran for the presidency as a DPP candidate, they kind of gave her a thumbs down after seeing her in Washington. And that was, greatly resented by some people on Taiwan and some of the United States. But it was the US at that time behaving within the framework that Kaiser and Shelley have intimated. The other pillar was, for decades, clear US military superiority. And it was really demonstrated in the mid-90s during a 9-month Taiwan Strait crisis, what's now known as the third Taiwan Strait crisis, that all we had to do was show up. That an aircraft carrier battle group was a win button, to use that phrase. And China had no answer to that. The idea that they didn't even have the means to cross the Taiwan Strait in large numbers from a cold start, but we had enormous capability to make sure that they would fail. That's no longer true. The PLA is arguably the second most powerful military force on the planet. As DOD revealed in their annual report to Congress last fall, the Chinese are moving away from a minimal nuclear deterrence. They're on course to build 1,000 nuclear warheads, quintupling the size of their current force by the end of this decade. And that also says something about how China views the prospects for great power war, as Shelley intimated. The Chinese also drew that lesson from Ukraine, that the era when peace and stability were the dominant trends, as Xi Jinping likes to tell President Biden, is under severe stress. And for the first time since the end of the old Cold War, the prospect of major power war and even nuclear war are back on the table. And so I think people on Taiwan are right to question, if the US wouldn't get directly militarily involved in Ukraine, not that we haven't done a lot to arm and buttress the Ukrainians, are we really going to go to war with the nuclear power over Taiwan? And that's a question no one in Washington seems to want to talk about. Everyone acknowledges that Russia is a dominant nuclear power, and it would be folly to declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine or to break the Russian blockade in the Black Sea of Ukrainian ports. But people talk blithely about going to war with China over Taiwan, as if we wouldn't face the same kind of consideration. The other pillar that's eroded is China is no longer a weak country. In the past, when there were crises with the United States because of the US accidentally bombing their embassy in Belgrade in the former Yugoslavia in 1999. There was great public anger in China. There was protest in the streets. They used rocks to destroy our embassy almost as effectively as we used advanced weapons to destroy their embassy in Belgrade. But it was understood, I think, by the Chinese government and then accepted by the Chinese people in 1999 that China did not have the military or economic strength to respond proportionately to what they viewed as a deliberate attack by the United States. China no longer has weakness as an excuse. When when Speaker Pelosi's plane flew into Taiwan in early August, the Chinese censors were busy censoring Chinese social media because one of the dominant moods they were seeing is, why haven't we shot her aircraft down? Why haven't we intercepted it with Chinese fighters? And so they have kind of a problem like we do in some cases of ultra-nationalism, especially among some younger Chinese who have never known a weak China, who don't remember the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward, who have only known a rising China and have been indoctrinated with years of video of the mighty People's Liberation Army. And so I think that if we had another crisis like a Belgrade embassy bombing, or when in 2001, when a Chinese fighter aircraft collided with the US reconnaissance aircraft off China's coast, in 2001, that issue was resolved in 11 days. I think if that happened today, it wouldn't be wrapped up for months and perhaps years. It would be more like the Pueblo incident with North Korea, because China views itself and the expectations of its people are that they are a strong country and that they will respond to deep insult with power rather than with submission. So that's all that happy talk. One thing I'd add, I picked up the thread that I think Kaiser started about kind of the assumptions I still hold about the China-Taiwan issue. One is that, to paraphrase him, Taiwan remains a crisis to be avoided for Xi Jinping, not an opportunity to be seized. He has a lot on his plate. Today the Chinese announced that they're shutting down Chengdu for COVID. That's a city of 21 million people and a key manufacturing center. Chinese economy is struggling like really it never has, largely due to these COVID restrictions, ever since reform and opening started. I think they're technically in a recession, although the government still claims modest GDP growth in order to avoid that tag. He's got a party congress in mid-October, where he'll probably succeed in being nominated and agreeing to have a third term as party general secretary, president of China, and chairman of the Central Military Commission. And so he then looks longer term out at things that keep him awake at night, and he has to worry about Chinese demographic trends, which, like Taiwan, China is now a rapidly aging society. So a lot of the demographic benefit that earned them their prowess as the top manufacturing nation in the world are now going to be challenged. And they have to bring in a lot more automation, a lot more robots, just to kind of maintain their place as they also try to shift from an export and investment-driven economic model to one more driven by consumption. So this issue is one that I think for Beijing, they feel is forced upon them. They weren't looking for a problem this summer. That said, I think we are in a fourth Taiwan crisis. I was commenting before we began with your other guests that it kind of has a Guns of August feel, to paraphrase Barbara Tuchman's book, that it seems like there was a lot of shouting and chest beating a month ago, and now it's over. Well, actually, it isn't over. Every day since Speaker Pelosi left Taiwan, Chinese Air Force is doing unprecedented things. They're flying aircraft over the mutually acknowledged but unofficial center line in the middle of the Taiwan Strait. And instead of doing it as they've done for 2 years in the southwest corner of Taiwan's air defense identification zone, 200 nautical miles from the island, they're doing it in the northern and central areas where they're 50 miles from being over Taipei. So they did some unprecedented things in the exercise after Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan. They flew ballistic missiles directly over the island for the first time. including some that landed in Japan's claimed EEZ. They surrounded Taiwan with these missile impact areas, which is sort of reminiscent of something they did in '96, but on steroids. So they even called their drill a blockade drill. And so I think, one thing that I think listeners might need to know is we got used to thinking of the PLA as sort of a noisy demonstration army. They would make loud noises, stage operatic exercises when something made them angry, but they haven't been to war since 1979. The PLA hasn't been a noisy demonstration army for 20 years. In each case where their sovereignty has been challenged over that time, whether it's the Senkaku Diaoyutai Islands dispute with Japan, the South China Sea dispute, or border dispute with India, the military has, without inflicting mass lethality, nonetheless changed the status quo. And I think that's what they're doing on the Taiwan Strait now. I think we're going to see a continued repetition of the unprecedented things they did if provoked sufficiently again. And they're going to do new things they have never done, that would really force Taiwan to make a decision whether they have to shoot first. For example, they could fly manned or unmanned aircraft directly over the island of Taiwan and sort of dare Taiwan to shoot. They could start to send their Navy and the world's largest Coast Guard inside Taiwan's territorial limit, both around the main island and around these offshore islands that Taiwan held, some of which are right at the Chinese coast, some of which are a bit further away, like the Penghus. So there's, I want to remind people that we tend to frame Chinese options as do nothing or invade. This is not a light switch that's either on or off. They have enormous capacity across entire span of domains: economic, political, diplomatic, information, legal domains, in addition to military domain, to continuously ratchet up the pressure. And at the end of the day, I agree with Kaiser. What the Chinese want, even in terms of unification, if they ever announce their intent to bring that to closure sooner rather than later, what they want is a political settlement they can call reunification. They don't want a red flag flapping over the rubble of Taipei. But at the same time, if Taiwan or Washington or the two in combination cross what's clearly to the Chinese a red line, they will go to war. It may not look like the war that we've all imagined, the D-Day type invasion. It will be an open-ended period of hostility. And East Asia, which has been the driver of global economic growth for 30 years, will become a war zone. And it won't be limited to the Taiwan Strait. The Chinese Liberation Army the People's Liberation Army has the capacity to strike every US base in East Asia, to kill or disable US satellites in outer space, and to break a lot of the key economic lifelines that made even China prosperous, let alone Taiwan. So that's not a bridge they want to cross, but at the same time, this strong historical aggrievement that Kaiser mentioned, is a real thing. Even if Xi Jinping doesn't feel that aggrieved, they've trained the Chinese people for 3 generations to feel hostility at China's treatment during the Century of Humiliation. And then in the more recent past, kind of China's treatment today. I think that's one of the reasons, I can agree with Kaiser that wolf warrior diplomacy is the opposite of diplomacy, and it achieves negative net good for China. So you have to ask yourself why they're doing it. It's because they're addressing that nationalistic public opinion, and that as China's and the Communist Party's legitimacy, which had rested for 40 years on economic growth, appears to be facing a tougher uphill road in delivering on those public expectations, they're going to double down, and they are doubling down on nationalism. And so I find all these trends very troubling. The main kind of binding agent between the United States and China, and at the time tertiarily between Taiwan, was we have no solution to this, conundrum. It's a problem left over from history that now is getting amplified in the 21st century. And so our impulse, I think, for both the United States and China was to kick this problem down the road. Stick to this policy of strategic ambiguity, because anything that we did to try and solve the problem or realize a free and independent Taiwan, which, mind you, built itself into a vibrant, prosperous democracy over the course of this policy of strategic ambiguity, that anything we did to try and solve this or resolve it would actually produce the war we've been trying to avoid.
Thank you very much indeed. So you are advocating for a status quo policy, really, before Pelosi's visit,
I would argue that we can achieve our goals and help Taiwan secure its legitimate security goals under the current policy. There was a wonderful tweet today written by Congressman Chris Murphy from Connecticut that talked about this. And he talked about the problem in Washington of people who are kind of bandwagoning onto this idea that, we need a more robust and determined policy, and that strategic ambiguity was holding us back. Strategic ambiguity is a policy that's been holding us back. For one thing, if we violated it overtly and clearly, and there are bills in Congress that, if passed as currently drafted, would do precisely that, then China would go to war, as I just said. So, if we need to buttress Taiwan's defense or help it buttress its own defense, we have been doing that for 50 years. We can keep doing it with the current policy of strategic ambiguity, with self-imposed restrictions on the level of visits between the two places. The Chinese have had to assume for years, as conservative military planners, that any war over Taiwan would involve the full, involvement of the United States. So suddenly declaring that openly wouldn't add to deterrence. It would just provoke the crisis.
Yeah, thank you. Before the war in Ukraine, the Americans and also the British had surprisingly good intelligence information about what was happening in Moscow and at the front line. How good is our intelligence information about what China is up to, both in military terms, but also political terms?
It's hard for me to characterize that. I've been retired for a couple of years, going on 3 years, and I wouldn't want to convey either overconfidence or negativity. It's a constant problem. You have to continue to check your assumptions and test them when possible through real-world data and evidence. I think on the whole, the U.S. government has had a very good handle. I'm sure that no analyst inside my former agency was surprised that the Chinese reacted to Speaker Pelosi's visit the way they did. In fact, they kind of underperformed because they didn't do some of the more menacing things that I noted. But I think China's a harder target than it was even 10 years ago. It's a more restrictive society. As the Chinese, even before Xi Jinping took the leadership roles, going back 10 years ago now, they have a very paranoid view of the United States, and they saw color revolutions and the Arab Spring, and they really started to harden their whole system, even by 2010. And I think today, and they've also become very technologically proficient. So you can never rest on your laurels, but I also think that on this topic, China, Taiwan, there really are no secrets that are very long in duration. I think that they play out pretty quickly in the real world through Chinese policy and reciprocally for the United States, that there's no secret plan, to launch an invasion of Taiwan tomorrow. And I'm relatively confident about that, not because of intelligence, other than the mental kind, because if China was going to go to war over Taiwan and it assumed that would involve the full-throated military intervention of the United States, it would not be subtle or secret for very long. They would do a full national mobilization. They would have to ready their population through press to prepare for economic hardship, to prepare for body bags coming home to parents and grandparents for the first time in 2 generations. And they would have to prepare for a long war because, again, as conservative military planners, I don't think they ever assumed that everything's going to go great. They've seen what happened to the Russians in Ukraine. by being overly optimistic about what a second Ukrainian war would look like.
So the lessons the Chinese are drawing from the Ukraine war, what do you think these lessons are?
I think they're surprised how bad the Russians performed, because it wasn't just that they didn't do exotic things well. They failed to do World War II style combined arms operations in a competent manner, where you coordinate air, ground, and other assets to produce a battlefield result. They failed miserably, and I think they do maybe want to take a second look at Taiwan's will to defend themselves. It's easy to write Taiwan off as a military power. It's a rich country. It has GDP 6 times Ukraine's, and per capita GDP of Taiwan is about 10 times at least Ukraine's. But their military is 2/3 smaller today than it was 10 years ago. Their total defense budget of 17 billion, which I think they're raising now to 19 billion, it's less than TMSC spends every year on market capitalization. It wouldn't buy an aircraft carrier in the United States. And so when they do spend their money, though, that $17 billion, when they buy weapons from us, they tend to buy very expensive high-end capability, most of which a lot of analysts believe would be irrelevant in war. It would be airplanes that couldn't get off the ground because their runways had all been destroyed by Chinese missiles in the first hours of a war. It would be main battle tanks that can't cross most of the bridges in Taiwan today. So that's why you keep hearing US advocates for Taiwan defense arguing that adopt this porcupine strategy, which Taiwan's government has done nominally. But it's going to be a tough road, and it's hard to justify the kind of support we're giving to Ukraine when, to a lot of Americans, they kind of question the extent to which Taiwan is willing to expend effort on its own defense, including right now they only have 4 months of military service for conscripts. I don't know if you were ever in the armed forces, but you might fire your gun one time in that 4 months. They have no ready reserve. So they have a population of 23 or 24 million, but military service is kind of looked down upon, and I'd kind of defer to Shelley on this point. For a long time, the military in Taiwan, was the armed wing of the Kuomintang party, just like the PLA is the armed wing of the Communist Party. And they were kind of the armed wing of martial law. That was the military that was suppressing dissent, and the Taiwan intelligence services. And I think that left deep marks. So even today, people on Taiwan who feel strongly about the need to strengthen their self-defense may not want to invest their only son in that venture. And they may not want to spend money on a bigger defense budget for a war that may never come.
Thank you very much. Maybe a few questions to all of our speakers before we then open it up to questions from the audience. And we have already quite a few questions which have been asked. What about the role of Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader? What, as far as we know, do we know what he is thinking? Does he want to achieve some sort of unification with Taiwan under whatever auspices during his likely third term in office? Or would he be happy to wait until 2049, the 100-year anniversary of the Chinese Revolution? Kaiser, what do you think?
Well, I think to some extent, when we've been talking about what China wants, and I'm speaking for myself for sure, but I maybe presume that John and Shelley both agree, we are talking about what Xi Jinping himself wants. He has an extraordinary level of personalistic control there. But I actually have a kind of counterintuitive take on what that means. I think that the fact that he has arrogated to himself these sort of unparalleled levels of power, that he is chairman of everything, makes him in some sense unable to pass the buck or blame anyone else were he to roll the dice and lose. It's a curb actually on adventurism. He can maintain his legacy with sufficiently kind of belligerent saber rattling without actually having to make a move. He can appease nationalists and he can make himself look tough. He can improve the capabilities of the PLA without having to deploy it, without having to make the move. I think that's his still optimum outcome. He does not want roll the dice on an actual invasion and come out with a bloody nose. He just risks too much. Right now, I think I talked about this with Jessica Chen Weiss just yesterday. She has a terrific article. She cites work by Taylor Fravel at MIT, who I suggest you look at, and by Andrew Chubb, who's an Australian scholar, who both looked at this relationship between nationalist or belligerent behavior and actual nationalist rhetoric. And they found that when China is experiencing sort of domestic crises, what Andrew Chubb would call legitimacy deficits, when the conventional wisdom says that that's when they would do the rally around the flag, that's when they would wag the dog. But empirically, it looks as though, in fact, when there are such situations, China actually is less belligerent internationally. Now, this is not a guide. I mean, past performance is not a guide for but I don't think we should assume either that just because Xi Jinping is now experiencing domestic crises ranging from collapsing real estate sector to potential the real difficulties right now. We see them all over the place, right? From the zero COVID policy on down. That does not mean he's going to risk something adventurous. So I think that's what he's thinking. Now, he does have sort of a Carlylean sense of himself as an historic figure who wants to, make his mark in history. But I think he's also maybe sufficiently full of self-regard that he believes he's already done so.
Well, we thought Putin had that idea as well, but
right. He's not Putin. I think he's not. I think that there's a lot of incorrect parallels that are just sort of blithely drawn between the situation in Central Eastern Europe and in East Asia, and we should be really careful about that. I think that there's a lot of just sort of careless analogy drawing going on.
Okay, thank you. Shelley, can I ask you the same question? And can you also talk about the future of the political lineup in Taiwan as far as you can judge?
Sure. I agree with Kaiser that, and actually with Kaiser and John, that, for Xi Jinping, Taiwan is a crisis to be avoided, not an opportunity to be seized. This is the worst case scenario for Xi Jinping, especially summer of 2022, staring down the barrel of the 20th Party Congress, and there's a crisis in the Taiwan Strait. That's just the worst, because he has no certainty about how that's going to wind up at all. So, I looked at a lot of what was happening this summer and the sort of, they started escalating. That is to say, the Beijing started escalating well before Pelosi ever went. And I think what they were genuinely trying to do was to get her to call it off and to not push the situation to the absolute limit. The only way they knew to persuade the US, either Pelosi or I think they also hoped the Biden administration would find a way to either persuade or compel her to back off. The only way they knew how to do that was through this escalating series of threats and actions aimed at creating an understanding among the US policy community that Taiwan would pay a high price for the action that a US leader was about to take. And they failed, right? They failed to stop the visit. And so now they have to follow up with, they can't just sort of fold the tent and go home. So that's where this kind of guns of August thing comes from. But I think a lot of Beijing's behavior in recent years has been aimed at deterring Taiwan and the US from taking the kind of actions that would force Beijing to go to war when it's not ready, it's not confident, and it's not choosing the time and method of its attack. At the same time, though, in addition to that, there's a very unsettling dimension of the Ukraine war to me, which is when the Russians went into Ukraine, the rationale was we're going to replace the government in Ukraine. We're going to set up a puppet government that answers to Moscow and all that kind of thing. But subsequently, it started to look like maybe the real objective of this war is carving off the eastern portion, solidifying Russia's hold on Crimea, and ideally maybe also taking the southern coast of Ukraine. So what looked like total war actually was a war with more limited objectives. And that's something that I've started to worry about with respect to the PRC. They could use limited means of the, some combination of things that John's just been talking about to achieve a very limited goal. So we're not asking for total surrender. We don't expect you to, enter into a reunification agreement today. We're just going to tell you, if you continue to buy weapons from the United States, this punishment is going to get worse and worse. And it would be really hard, I think, for the Taiwanese government to justify some of the suffering short of an invasion, short of, aerial bombardment of Taiwan. Very hard to justify that suffering on the grounds that, well, we have to continue to do whatever it is that they want us to stop doing. But Taiwan stops buying weapons from the US, that's game over. It's not game over on day one, it's game over in 5 or 10 years. So the picture really is very complicated, and there are many ways that patience could enable the PRC to, in the famous phrase, win without fighting, or at least win without killing any civilians.
Thank you. Pelosi and the United States want to save face. The Chinese want to save face regarding Taiwan. So what is the way forward, John Culver? What would be your advice if the White House asked you to act as an advisor to Biden from tomorrow?
No pressure.
From your lips to God's ears.
I think one, be confident in our own ability to shape events short of big demonstrative actions. Speaker Pelosi is the leader of a key branch of government. She can travel where she wants. I think what harmed U.S. reputation more was pretty clear. President Biden thought the visit was a bad idea. He kind of said so publicly, and it happened anyway. So that sends a signal to the Chinese that the executive branch, which is always their preferred kind of interactor, can't even deliver on its own policies. So I would try to start repairing that. You ought to have a better understanding and communication so that when the United States speaks and acts, that we're really acting from what's driving our strategic needs rather than kind of the atmosphere of the moment or the need for personal aggrandizement. I think also in the United States right now, and the administration can't do much about this, sort of upholding Taiwan, congressional travel to Taiwan, op-eds claiming we should do this, that, or the other. It's a real performative aspect where they're not going to have to pay the price for their advice if it's ever listened to being implemented, but they can feel ennobled or help their think tank or tell Congress or the Department of Defense what they think those consumers want to hear. So you just have to really take a longer term view, understand where we are in a strategic rivalry, try and define how we're not going to get pulled into a hot war over an issue like Taiwan, where, I don't know who wins that war. I know Taiwan is destroyed. So that's all I need to know. It's the most Pyrrhic victory since the ancient Greeks invented the term. So I think that, for me, a policy focused ought to be preventing war. It doesn't mean we do fewer FONOPs or Taiwan Strait transits. It means opening, reopening. I mean, one problem and the core problem right now, and the place to start is U.S.-China relations, I think, are arguably today worse than they've been since normalization. By kind of any measure about significance or depth of high-level meetings. And I'm not blaming the United States because God knows it's, takes two to tango. But it's better to have regular dialogue to build some level of at least familiarity, if not trust, between core interlocutors at a level below Xi Jinping and Joe Biden, and to build mechanisms for crisis management, because we're lucky. So far, we haven't had, if this is the second Cold War, it's about, 1958. We haven't had our Cuban Missile Crisis. We haven't had that fixing event where both sides stare into the abyss of annihilation and decide that they need to install some guardrails. So let's get busy on that now. I said if there was an EP3 crisis today, it wouldn't be wrapped up in 11 days. Because simply the communication mechanisms to do that, the level of trust we had in 2001 doesn't exist today. Right. The access of our ambassadors in Beijing and their ambassadors here wouldn't allow it. And so you have to build a basic mechanism to deal with China on the issues where we both have a need in order to just communicate. You don't have to agree with them, and you may not like sitting and listening to their litany of diatribe, but you have to at least have a capacity to be heard, even if you don't like what you're hearing in return.
Thank you very much for this very pessimistic note on the whole. Maybe we should.
Well, I have an optimistic note. Despite all of this, U.S.-China trade is probably going to break all records this year. So, despite pandemics and lockdowns and trade wars and everything, and the U.S. will probably run a $300 billion trade deficit with China. So at least, we haven't fully decoupled. We don't have the capacity to wage cold or hot war yet without harming our own deep economic interests. But keep your eye on that.
And don't forget that Taiwanese companies are right in the middle of all of that U.S.-China trade.
I mean, Shelley, how many Taiwanese live in China today?
Nobody knows.
1 million, right? It's always been 1 million.
The number is ever increasing. Nobody really knows, but it's a large number. And
this is a great moment to plug your book, Shelley.
Thanks,
Shelley wrote
Kaiser.
a fantastic book called "The Tiger Leading the Dragon," and I interviewed her about that book on the Seneca podcast. It's fantastic. It's a great book, and it's about that. The very complicated economic relationship and how important these Taiwanese contract manufacturers were going to the mainland in the 1990s in building what we see today, China's phenomenal manufacturing ecosystem.
Sounds pretty good. Shelley, you should have sent me a flyer and we would have put it up on the screen and sales would have multiplied. I think it's time for our Q&A session with the audience. Can I ask Leila to ask the first question? And Leila is one of our Krasno assistants, and she's joining us tonight from Sweden, from cold Gothenburg.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to say thank you to the panelists. This was a very great talk. It was very interesting. And a lot of the people in the Q&A questions were wondering what the American public view is on this issue, more so if Americans will go into combat against China, especially with ethical issues such as the Uyghur concentration camps.
I think that's a question for Kaiser, isn't it?
Oh, I don't know about that. Sure. Look, no. I guess the answer is no. I think that there's probably when push comes to shove, there's very little appetite once body bags come home. I mean, this isn't a pushover country. This isn't liberating Kuwait. This isn't deposing Saddam Hussein either. This is a formidable fighting force, and it would be on their home territory, and they have really they have the DF-22 carrier killer missiles. I mean, there are all sorts of things that it would be very, very bad, and I think we would see that right away. I think that if it really came down to it, no, there would not be. But let me underscore that China doesn't have a ton of appetite for anything like this either. So that's something I do think is an optimistic piece of it. Now, as to whether things like the atrocity in Xinjiang bear on this at all, I think it's really important. That's something that I said in my little preamble earlier today. I think we need to understand first of all, how this is viewed in China. I mean, where things like the crisis in Xinjiang, very, quote unquote, liberal Chinese friends of mine who do under ordinary circumstances have an awful lot of empathy for what ethnic and religious minorities in China would endure, they still understand that this issue has been weaponized by the United States, that it has been seized upon, and ironically by people who were behind the Muslim ban in the United States, and really used quite cynically, deployed quite cynically. Now, this is a problem, I think, for people like me, because hey, I think that even if that is true, it is still of itself egregious enough that it warrants our attention. Like, we know the dimensions of it. All the extra legal detentions are something that we should full-throatedly denounce, but doing that doesn't, that suddenly I'm not able to make this all these other arguments that I want to make about how we tend to blow things that China does out of proportion because we feel this psychological discomfiture at being surpassed by China. So it's a real problem. And when I've talked to other people like me who sort of sit in the political middle of this, Xinjiang is an issue that is really vexing to us, because I think no person with any kind of conscience would fail to recognize the enormity of this. I mean, you don't have to use the G word to see this still as something that is not tolerable in the 21st century.
Thank you. Pete, would you ask the next question, please?
Sure thing. We have a hypothetical from James Evans. He's curious as to whether, if push comes to shove and there's a PRC blockade of Taiwan, do the speakers believe that the US and its allies would violate this PRC blockade of Taiwan? And would that lead to further conflict in the region? And we could offer this question to Shelley and then get a comment from John.
I actually would rather hear John speak on this, because I think his capacity to really pick apart the military issues is much higher than mine. Thank you, though.
Okay. So a blockade under any name, an attempt to cut off, a blockade means you're cutting off all shipment into Taiwan and all shipping leaving Taiwan, both maritime and air. That's an act of war. So if China declares a blockade against Taiwan, it's going to war with Taiwan, unless they get especially cute and announce, as we did in Cuba in 1962, what they're doing is a quarantine. And so one scenario that I'm worried about is that the US starts to ship a lot of shiny new hardware to Taiwan, and China announces that these arms sales, these arms deliveries are going to be destabilizing the peace of tranquility on the Taiwan Strait and threaten the vital interest of China. So they announced not a blockade, but a quarantine. And what they're asking and using, again, world's largest Coast Guard is the Chinese Coast Guard, plus a sizable contingent of kind of volunteers, called maritime militia, is to board and inspect all vessels and require aircraft to land first in China for inspection prior to going on to Taiwan. And so they wouldn't be cutting off food, energy, all the vital sustenance, or stopping Taiwan's key exports. They would be stopping weapons flow. That would be harder to deal with politically a bit, but I think the lawyers in the Pentagon, the State Department would quickly conclude that a quarantine under any name is an act of war if we choose to call it that. And there would be enormous political pressure in the United States to do something in order to escort cargoes or to use the US Navy to break a Chinese quarantine. And I don't see any way that that's done without major conflict. As Kaiser intimated, the PLA may not be 20 feet tall, but they can strike with precision anywhere within the entire Western Pacific. So any carrier strike group, any US base could be held at risk. So at a minimum, you have the largest naval battle since World War II in some form or function. And I think that threat of escalation, I think then the idea that I tried to raise a little earlier may sink in. China's a quite capable nuclear power. And they've got somewhere between 150 and 200 ICBMs that can reach the United States today. And by the end of this decade, they're going to have several hundred. Now, they may not ever surpass the US. We have 1,500 treaty-limited ICBMs, as does Russia. But the mere fact that you have capacity to not only destroy most of your urban areas in both countries, but then make the rubble bounce. I think is something that's going to have to get picked up on and thought hard about in the Oval Office. That this sounds great on paper, and it's great to plan around it in the Pentagon and to run simulations all around Washington. But when push comes to shove, it's going to come down to a decision of the US president, fully conscious of the risks that he's going to be running, which are unlike anything that the US president had to deal with since Harry Truman.
Thank you. Is there a chance that we might exaggerate the military capabilities of the Chinese as we perhaps exaggerated what Putin and the Russians could do in Ukraine?
I think so, because they haven't been to war since 1979, or if you want to get technical, since the late 1980s, because they were still punishing Vietnam for a decade after their invasion. And I think the Chinese worry about that. They know that they have a shiny, fairly high-tech, modern military that has never been tested in battle. And so I think the leadership has doubts. But the thing is, in a lot of the capabilities that I talked about, anti-ship ballistic missiles, long range like missiles that can hit Guam or hit any base in Japan, there's an inherent lethality in those systems. You don't need to train to a fare thee well if you've prepared to use that system and have a targeting and launch capability that cannot be easily denied by an adversary. And so it could be that China, the things, let's say in a hypothetical conflict, things don't go for China's way, that maybe Taiwan gets lucky and sinks a major Chinese capital ship early in a conflict. The thing is, I think any war over Taiwan and between China and the United States is going to be a long war, not a short war. And China has enormous industrial capacity. In the US, we have 4 shipyards that can build naval combatants like destroyers. In China, they have at least 20. They build 43% of all the shipping in the world. And they manufacture so much steel that their surplus capacity is larger than all of Europe's full capacity. So things that haven't mattered, and not just beyond heroism or training of the fighting force, but industrial capacity to wage long-term war, are going to come into importance in a way, again, they haven't since World War II.
Thank you very much indeed. Can we have the next question, Leila, please?
Yeah, of course. I believe it was Kaiser who said that the US influence over the Pacific is waning. So with that, Stuart Kaplan wants to ask, how are Japan and South Korea reacting to the growing tensions between US and Taiwan now?
Well, so far, I think that beginning with Shinzo Abe, Japan has been increasingly vocal in its support for Taiwan and has aligned itself more closely. Abe himself and his successors have really pushed this idea of the Quad, which is, of course, and the very concept of the Indo-Pacific. This idea, it actually comes out of Tokyo. So I think that's Japan. South Korea is a little more torn. First of all, it isn't always friendly with Tokyo, but also it doesn't feel like it's its fight. Remember, Japan was Taiwan's colonial master for 50 years. It feels a little more invested, and the southern islands of Japan are very, very close to territory that both Taiwan and China claim. Now, South Korea, as you may remember, the fairly newly elected conservative president of South Korea ducked out of a meeting with Nancy Pelosi, claiming to be on vacation. So I think we can read something into that. I think they understand that there's no upside for South Korea. Even the conservative party in South Korea sees no real upside of throwing in too completely on this issue. They don't want to get squeezed.
Thank you very much. Pete, can you ask the next question, please?
Sure thing. We have a question from Andrew Gary. How do American allies in East Asia view U.S. policy?
Yeah, I think that's the same
Taiwan?
question.
The same question.
Yeah.
Brian Keyleth is curious about what the Chinese have gained by taking over Hong Kong and what the implications that takeover might have on the Taiwan situation. And we can offer this question to Shelley.
Okay. Yeah. I think one thing they've gained is a humongous, long-running stomachache. It's swallowing poison. I don't actually I think it's unlikely that Beijing wanted to have a confrontation with Hong Kong society this early. The expectation in 1997 was that there would be a long glide path in which Hong Kong would increasingly resemble the rest of China, and that by the end of 50 years, there would be a kind of smooth and kind of uneventful merging. And when that didn't happen, it was confusing. You know, why did Hong Kong people, it seemed like the more time elapsed, the more feisty Hong Kong people became. And I think what really what catalyzed the catastrophe, the disaster in Hong Kong, was the lack of leadership, or the lack of authority, perhaps, of the Hong Kong leadership to solve a problem that everybody could see coming years ahead of time. So the particular event that really touched off the final stage of the Hong Kong resistance was the extradition law, which wasn't even officially demanded by Beijing. The Hong Kong authorities kind of decided that, you know, they could probably do it, so they went for it, and that touched off this escalating series of protests. But whether rightly or wrongly, the Hong Kong authorities seem not to have believed that they had any authority to make a political settlement. So instead, they just threw the police at the protesters and said, you know, we got to use a police response to end this thing. And then, you know, you saw what happened. So I don't think that this was the plan. And I don't think this is in any way, it's very hard for me to understand how in any way the PRC benefits from the just the complete failure of its policy of one country, two systems, of, you know, some kind of peaceful unification, like all of the stuff that Hong Kong was supposed to demonstrate has all failed. So I don't think it's easy to be running Hong Kong right now. Go ahead.
I want to, I mean, I can't help it. It's too long being a host of a show. I got to ask Shelley a follow-up on this. You said in a recent interview, I think it might have been the one in the New Yorker, you talked about how there was a kind of dynamic at work that struck me as quite similar to what was happening in Hong Kong with Taiwan, with like what happened to cause the sunflower movement in 2012. See, because I mean, suddenly you talked about maybe that it was a victim of its own success, that, you know, the Santong policy, you know, the three connections policy, whatever it's called, brought a lot of mainlanders in, brought a lot of mainland investment in. You know, there was the threat of this new investment law. And I saw a lot of parallels to Hong Kong. Can you talk a little bit about that? I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Beijing can never quite get its mind around, or, you know, what the leaders in Beijing cannot get their minds around, is that they are not beloved in any of these places. that the places on their periphery are at best skeptical and at worst actively hostile. So their idea that maximum engagement, you know, lots of people going back and forth, lots of mainlanders coming in and out of Hong Kong, lots of mainlanders coming across the Taiwan Strait, that this is how we're going to show the people in Hong Kong and Taiwan respectively that, you know, they're part of China, that this is great, that this is a family get together, you know, this is a reunion that we're having. The opposite is true, both in Hong Kong and in Taiwan. The more mainland people came in, the more the local people realized, whoa, if this trend were to continue without limit, we would be completely swallowed up, drowned out, neutralized, and disappeared in our own land. And so, you know, you see, there's a wonderful documentary. Theory. Yeah. There's a wonderful documentary by Malti Kaiding, a professor in the UK, about the localism movement, and it doesn't always reflect well on Hong Kong people. There's a lot of that kind of, you said replacement theory, Kaiser. There's a lot of kind of ethnocentrism or
Shelley.
ugly stereotypes.
Yeah, thank
But
you.
that's the reality of the world we live in,
I think we need another program on Hong Kong, don't we?
Yeah.
We talked a lot about the military situation and whether or not the United States would get involved and how it would get involved. If the United States decided Taiwan is not worth it to provoke a world war, a nuclear war, and would wash its hands of it, would it matter in the end? Would it mean the end of American superpower status, or would it, like the withdrawal from Vietnam, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, in the end matter little, except for the people locally affected? John, sorry.
I think it would be a foolish I mean, it's a hypothetical. I'll try not to fight the hypothetical, but that's kind of a Hobbesian choice that no administration would want to make.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not going to. That's why we have this arcane and complicated set of touchstones for China-Taiwan policy from the 3 communiques. And the difference between China's One China principle and U.S. One China policy. And then the Taiwan Relations Act, which actually isn't a treaty with Taiwan at all. It's an agreement within our own branches of government about Taiwan policy. That's one reason, again, it argues in favor of the current policy of strategic ambiguity, because if you put yourself in a position where you have to make these Hobbesian choices, by definition, you won't like what the world looks like when you come out on the other side. So if you try to hedge and announce a less vocal support for Taiwan's defense, Congress is going to make sure that you remember and have the Taiwan Relations Act tattooed on your back or something. And so it becomes a domestic political issue very quickly, and one that I don't think any president of either party or any other party could actually survive. It would be seen as a litmus test of will and strategic rivalry with China. I think, if I stop fighting the hypothetical, and let's say we get a really interesting president, not like the last one, please, but interesting in a new way, that they would probably still try to practice ambiguity. They might come out and say that, what we want from China to do is announce that they're going to forswear forceful unification under any circumstances and work toward unification only in peaceful terms through all of the links that have been building over the last 30 years. Well, the US wants to set an example, so we're going to announce that short of China's attempt to compel unification by force, we're going to become more moderate in our military posture. Assuming there isn't wholesale, domestic backlash against that. You could probably start to work towards something like a basis of trust, but it would be so fraught and really come down to a tangle of public opinions and domestic politics in China, in the United States, and on Taiwan.
No, I also meant geopolitically, as far as the American allies are concerned, what they might think, what would Japan, the Europeans, South Korea think about, basically selling out Taiwan.
Well, you would never agree and call it a selling of Taiwan. You'd say that you're trying to adjust policy to prevent war. And so what you're going to do is double down on offshore deterrence. You're going to strengthen your alliances and the demonstrable kinds of things in alliances between Japan, Australia, South Korea, and then all the allies and partners, around China's periphery. It would be, you could say you're going to put the Quad and the AUKUS and Indo-Pacific strategy on steroids as a way to manage peaceful competition with China and avoid, disastrous war. And that's about the best face I think you could put on it. I don't think that there's a single track, where the U.S. says we're out of Asia, and watches that go down gracefully, unless things have gotten so dire in the United States that there's domestic appeal to that.
Okay, thanks very much. We need another question. Pete, was it your turn or was it Leila's turn? I've forgotten.
I'll let Leila take the next question.
Oh, thank you. With that, Jing is asking, because we talked about how Taiwan doesn't have enough military power to defend itself against China, and that this is essentially just a game between the US and China and how Taiwan serves as a pawn. So Jing wants to know, is there any way Taiwan can choose to stay out of this game?
That's a question for Shelley, clearly.
It's very difficult because Taiwan is dependent on the US for its defense. So there was quite a bit of close parsing of Taiwanese official statements and semi-official statements ahead of the Pelosi visit. Because obviously the big public statements were like, yes, of course, you know, this is great for us. But the foreign ministry of Taiwan never said anything about it. The Taiwanese representative office in Washington never said anything about it. And the official representative of President Tsai's party in Washington, D.C. gave quotes to media that were expressing reservations about the visit. So, you know, if you wanted to, you could see that that the Taiwan government, the Tsai administration, was not encouraging the Pelosi visit in the way that you would expect if they were genuinely understanding it in the way that she said she intended it. And yet, after it happened, and, you know, the PRC had the big response and everything, a lot of people in Washington were saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe the Taiwans dragged us into this. You know, the Taiwans did not drag anybody anywhere. The Taiwans, as they're called, were dragged into this by US political actors. So that just shows you how hard it is for Taiwan to stay out of the middle. And if we had had a president in Taiwan, like, for example, the previous president, Ma Ying-jeou, who had perhaps been willing to be more vocal, even privately, you know that there would be people in Washington then saying, you know, these ungrateful Taiwanese politicians do not see all the beautiful things we do for them. So, you know, Taiwan is really damned if they do, damned if they don't situation. And to me, that makes it all the more incumbent on American leaders to think about what they're doing and to not allow themselves to be influenced by factors that are actually not relevant.
Thank you very much. Can we have the next question from Pete now?
Yes, we have a question about Larry from Larry Manna. He's curious about kind of the political dynamic of Taiwan here in the US, specifically how it impacts electoral politics in this country. So essentially, Larry is asking, how much of an impact would Taiwan have, say, in these midterms or just in future elections, as it appears to be at the center of global conversations?
That's for Kaiser, I'm sure.
Thanks. Somehow I get all the American domestic political ones, but no, I think that we have to understand it as defensive, not an offensive thing. To stake out a really sort of gung-ho pro-Taiwan position, especially if you're a Democratic politician, is basically a move to guard your right flank against criticism that you're soft on China. That's, you know, the long and short of it right there. And you know, on the right, of course, it's just sort of consistent with the kind of chest beating, you know, unapologetic insistence on maintaining American global hegemony, which is, you know, could be pretty on brand for the other party.
Thank you. If there was a serious crisis over Taiwan, another fourth or fifth Taiwan Strait crisis in a really serious way, would the European allies stand with the United States, or would they try to distance themselves? Because, as you know, the export market, China, is highly important. They don't want to antagonize the Chinese either.
Klaus, I feel like you should answer that one.
But I'm asking you. I like to have your input.
I don't know the mind of the European allies. I certainly wouldn't be in a position to speculate. I'm going to pass to John.
Okay.
Thanks, Kaiser. I think the Ukrainian conflict has kind of been enlightening, where I think there was some reluctance in European Union, especially, you know, you had the United States warning since October, November of 2021 that the Russians are going to invade Ukraine. And I think even the government of Ukraine did not quite believe us. So when it happened, you actually saw a snapback where the sanctions that the US and the European Union threatened in advance of the Russian invasion actually paled in comparison to the ones that we actually implemented. And so there was actually a kind of a strengthening of spine, if you will, at least in the economic domain. I think for the US, Taiwan might be a little more fraught. A lot would depend on how the crisis started and the general perception about like who was to blame. Because the one thing that most of our allies in Asia and then beyond have assumed is this is an American problem. And what they want from Washington first and foremost is competent management of it. And so in the last administration, and to the extent in this one, what you're seeing is more this recognition that we're in a strategic rivalry and that it kind of drives the domestic discussion. And so it doesn't take very much political courage right now to be critical of China and very supportive of Taiwan. In a crisis, again, the dynamic is going to shift. And I think the allies, especially if the war in Ukraine is still going on, if there's, God forbid, another pandemic or residual COVID, the economic situation is already so dire. I mean, I think any, major crisis between the US and China that looked like it was headed toward conflict, I think you'd see an unparalleled, global recession. And so a lot of the things that have been leveraged for China, leveraged for the United States, are going to be weighed by our allies. And what they're going to want is, I think, some sign that it's not just running on its own rails, that there's competent management and at least restraint at some level on both sides. And because the US is open and democratic, I think more of the pressure will be brought to bear on the US to find a solution in a way that is difficult to kind of enforce on China.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think I get the feeling that both Beijing and Moscow hope that in the long run, the Europeans wouldn't have the stamina to endure the crisis, to put up with something they're not really immediately affected by. Personally, I think that that probably is mistaken, because the transatlantic alliance, also the American export market, is so hugely important, even more than the Asian export market, if you only talk in economic terms, ignoring history, cultural links, political, democratic links. So I would say, maybe I hope, maybe it's wishful thinking, but I would say that in the end, the Europeans will not allow themselves to be divided from the US, certainly not the major countries. There will be some outliers, but not the major countries. But maybe that's just wishful thinking. Leila, can we have the next question?
Yeah, of course. Anonymous attendee talked about how we talked a lot about what military leaders should and should not do, but they want to know more what you guys recommend that US policymakers should do just in case of a Chinese force aggression.
Should I start? I mean,
Sure.
my thing, I mean, I think that before we even get to the point where we have to respond to actual aggression, we should sort of try to forestall that by good old-fashioned diplomacy. I think that, as Shelley said, and as John said, we can't just have our diplomatic contacts happening at the highest level. It can't just be an occasional phone call between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden. It can't be Anthony Blinken meeting with Wang Yi, or Yang Jiechi meeting with Jake Sullivan. That's just not enough. We need to ultimately bring back something like the S&DD, the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, which was a sort of through the whole year at many levels of bureaucracy, at many levels of and then always accompanied by quite robust track 2 dialogues happening in parallel. What I think we can get there, but I mean, I suggest you read this article by Jessica Chen Weiss, and maybe even go back and visit this book by a guy named Lyle Goldstein, who used to be at the U.S. Naval War College, who wrote a book called Meeting China Halfway. And in it, I mean, it may sound a little bit, pie in the sky, but he lays out a series of sort of escalating spirals of trust where we offer contingent compromises. We'll give on this issue in the explicit expectation that China will reciprocate. We just have to actually lay out these things. Here's how it goes. We do this, then you do that, then we do this, which is even better, and you do that, and then we rebuild what has been really, completely obliterated through 4 years of Trump, and then now a year and a half of Biden.
Thanks very much. Can we have another question? Pete, I think.
Yes, of course. We have a question from Jonathan Tay, who kind of is taking a positive outlook on the situation. He asks that, is it possible that this situation can be seen as a positive because it encourages a diplomatic solution? If not, is this silver lining just overshadowed by how tense and how hot things are right now with Chinese-American relations?
Who would like to take that question?
I mean, I suppose if I'm bleeding to death and somebody comes at me with a tourniquet, that's a positive development. But gosh, it would have been so much better to get out of the water before the shark bit me in the first place, right? So yes, there may be some turn to diplomacy in the hope of forestalling an absolute disaster. But I have to say, it's hard not to think that the actions of some American politicians, they could have made some different choices.
You guys have to pick up Shelley's next book,
prevented us from getting to this point.
Shelley's next book is called The Sword in the Temple Rafters and the Bloody Tourniquet. And it's great. It's full of all her best analogies ever deployed on Zoom calls.
Yeah,
that was amazing.
It was serious here, Kaiser. It's a serious topic. But I have a good question I just noticed from Prabha Fernandez, who asked, does China actually have a Monroe Doctrine like the United States has? And is it allowed to have one? Should it have one? Who would
I'll take it, but I'll probably over militarize it like I do most things. I was a military analyst for most of my career, recovering military analyst. Short answer, no, especially as an enunciated, policy that they will take action to prevent any foreign, footholds in their hemisphere. But in a sense, I don't subscribe to a view that's very sort of common among some intellectuals that China wants to return to a tributary system. I think most of the people that talk about that don't understand the tributary system. What they want, though, is, I'll use the term in an international relations way, they want us hegemony, especially in East Asia. Meaning, I think in the softest form, that China's interests are taken into account by all of its neighbors. It doesn't mean that no one ever does anything to displease China, but it means that they think about it hard. And they understand that there will be a cost that China can impose if they adopt policies or pursue relationships that China thinks are bad for itself. And I think that, part of their build of this term they love to use, comprehensive national power, becoming the largest trading nation, largest trading nation, largest manufacturing power in the world, with deep inroads into all of Southeast Asia, deep economic relations with Japan, there's a much shorter list of countries where China isn't the largest trading partner than there is of those who are. That part of that is sway. It's the ability to shape government opinion, shape policy without the resort to force, but always backed by the idea that if China did resort to force, that it would probably prevail unless every one of its neighbors kind of banded together to defend it.
Thank you very much indeed. Leila, would you ask the next question, please?
Yeah, of course. So Oliver Stelling is claiming that a lot of foreign policy experts of China haven't even stepped foot in the country in years. So with that, he is asking, what impact might this reduced fieldwork and academic research in China have on US-China relations in Taiwan?
Well, I think this is a really big problem. We being, American scholars who deal with these issues, who work on Chinese foreign policy, also Taiwan, have had a lot of Zoom calls over the last 2 years, especially as tensions have accelerated. We are talking. It's not like we've lost contact with them altogether. But it's really different. I remember a very important and famous person in U.S.-China relations. One time I was at a conference with her, and there were a lot of speakers from the mainland who were there, and everybody had like 3 minutes to talk. It was a very sort of superficial event. And I noticed she's not listening to any of the speeches. She's out in the audience talking to the Chinese scholars. And I realized it's because they don't say anything interesting when they're on the stage. They say something interesting during the coffee break or after dinner or in the car. And so she didn't
After
even
drinks.
bother. Yeah, after drinks. So, that's what we're not having. And I think it's a very significant damper on our ability to understand one another and to communicate.
Thank you. Pete.
Ved Sunil asks, will there ever be a future where a more amenable Chinese government can create its own sphere of influence in East Asia with willing participants? And Kaiser will offer this question to you.
Who can say? We're certainly not on track for it right now. I think that there's no reason to believe that would be so, but history is a very contingent thing. There are all sorts of twists and turns that are completely unforeseeable. So I don't think that's an answerable question, I'm afraid, although it's a fun one to think about.
Thank you. Can I just say that we have plenty of more questions which have been asked, but I would suggest that we perhaps finish at 7:30 or something like that. That gives us just less than 10 minutes to deal with some of the other questions. Later, if you would like to summarize some of the questions which are perhaps similar, then feel free to do that.
Yeah, there was a few people asking about how, if there was a military escalation, how could this impact the Chinese oil supply?
I think that's all you, John.
Well, China's highly reliant on imported oil. Most of it comes by sea from the Persian Gulf, although they've diversified and taken advantage of Russia's current predicament to somewhat expand their oil and gas transfers from Russia. But the thing is, it's not like gas that Russia and oil that Russia's not shipping to Europe can go to China. Those come from different fields and use different pipelines. So they're highly dependent. The thing is, if there's a war, kind of the US hasn't experienced this since World War II, there would be rationing. China has strategic petroleum reserves just like we do, probably like we do, about a 90-day supply. But if they're rationing and focusing on using domestic production, they've made huge investments in green technology. 24% of all the cars sold in China this year are electric. They could probably weather, and they could do all other things countries have done when they're denied resources like energy, which has moved to coal gasification. China has lots of coal. So they would have options. It would, on the one hand, it would be bad for the economy, but the war would be bad for the economy. So it would just be part of the new condition. And so I think, the US would have to carry out basically a naval blockade of Chinese energy supply for as long as the conflict lasted. And of course, all that time, China would be developing more means. If Russia's still their primary strategic partner, I think they would do everything they could to tap that even harder and get more energy from Russia. And then probably deal with unsavory countries that, as long as it doesn't require overseas transshipment, that the US could deny.
Thank you very much. Pete, feel also free to summarize a number of questions.
Sure. We have a question from Pravati Fernandez. She's curious if a Chinese takeover of Taiwan is inevitable. To what extent can the US delay such a takeover by pressuring China's economy without having self-inflicted wounds on the US economy? We've touched on this earlier, but for whichever speaker, feel free to hop in.
To zero extent. Right. To zero extent. Nothing the US can do to pressure China economically does not blow back on American consumers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
That's the answer.
Yeah.
I think we all agree. Leila, can you ask another question?
Yeah, we pretty much covered most of the questions, but there's a very open-ended one from Ved Sunil, and he's asking, how much of a problem does China really pose internationally if this were to escalate into a military conflict?
Well, I mean, I certainly have thoughts on this.
Yeah, go ahead.
And not just about Taiwan, but I think this is the big question that we all, anyone who undertakes to to form policy or to even form their own views on China has to wrestle with this question of what does China want in the world? What is China actually trying to do? Does it want to truly displace the United States as the global hegemon? And I think most people, I mean, although weirdly that idea seems to be quite current in the Beltway, most reasonable people think no, that it does not. Maybe at most it desires a kind of a seat at the table, certainly globally, but also maybe a regional hegemony, maybe something sort of commensurate with its place historically, which it held for a very, very long time as the dominant both economic and cultural and military force in the eastern part of the Eurasian landmass. Now, this is something unfortunately that there's very little consensus on in the United States, or if there is, I'm afraid that they're drawing very wrong conclusions. That there's this idea that China, in fact, has this 100-year plan for global domination. That everything is done with this great master plan in mind, and this is even coming out of some otherwise quite sensible people. I think that what we should really understand is that China is actually quite beleaguered and is very ad hoc and responds to both internal and external stimuli. Just as we do, that there is no master plan. They're muddling through. They're crossing the river, the famous Chinese expression, by feeling for stones all the time. That what we do matters an awful lot to what I mean. We are the big other actor. So how we talk about China affects what China does very much. So I think, unfortunately, we live in this gigantic glass house, and we're all carrying around megaphones. So, America's share in the global media discourse is very, very loud, and the Anglophone media, so dominated by the United States, gets to sort of set the tone for a lot of things, to China's great frustration. But we need to wield that power pretty carefully. I think we need. My job in the world is to try to steer public discourse on China back into a more rational direction.
Thank you, Kaiser. I think we can conclude, and I'm sure we will all agree, that tension is escalating, that tension can lead to dangerous conflict. The question, my final question to all three of our presenters would be, what can we do to prevent that such a rivalry, enmity is escalating into military conflict, which would be horrible, a terrible, probably nuclear war between the world's two largest powers. But I think both sides, as you rightly said just now, Kaiser, the United States is doing its bit to further escalate tension. But the Chinese are not innocent either. We look at Xinjiang, we look at unfair economic competition to some extent, to the surveillance state and the increase of an authoritarian government, not just domestically, but also in its foreign policy dimension. So essentially, both sides seem to have a lot of possibility to do something about the escalating tension. But the big question is, of course, what should be done to avoid that tension escalating into a terrible war? If you have the solution, I will pass your solution on to the White House right tonight. But please let me know, what is your solution for avoiding this escalation of tension collapsing into a major war? John, would you like to start?
First, make that a priority. Say that while we're in a rivalry with China, and if I could wax a little philosophical in 10 seconds, we're currently in a formative stage of this rivalry. We saw how long that took with the old Cold War, with the first Cold War. And at some point, we're going to reach the conclusion that competition itself is not a strategy. And so we're going to have to talk to the Chinese. We're going to have to start to manage tensions rather than just use them for political gain. And we're going to have to try and get China to agree that a core goal is to prevent war. We can still do a lot, even aggressively within that kind of those kind of lanes. But we have to understand what's at stake here, that things that we're doing for performative reasons could have real world consequences. And as we need to rebuild confidence here. I mean, I still think there's no threat that China poses to the United States that's as dire to sort of domestic political frame that we're experiencing. And there's nothing we can do for Taiwan if we don't maintain our democracy at home.
Thank you. Kaiser, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I completely, heartily agree with everything that John just said. I would add to that leadership really matters. Tone setting really matters in the United States as well as in China. In China, there's a little more direct control over media messaging. And I would hope, if I could speak directly to them that, if you want, as they profess to dial down the temperature, to lower the temperature, there's a lot that they can do through their management of social media, through their own rhetoric to do that. And at the same time, the United States, I think that collectively, people who, have the microphone, who are influencers in American policy and in media circles, people at think tanks, need to take some of the responsibility for that, to back down on some of this sort of crazy rhetoric, and to understand that lowering the temperature is ultimately in our interest as well, to forestall a crisis. Look, we're heading towards some kind of a crisis, and at that point, we can either stare into the abyss, as John said, and then back off, or we might go careening headlong into it, which is obviously just a terrible thing. But either way, let's not get to that point. If we see it coming, let's steer away.
Thank you. What is your advice to both governments, to both countries' leaders, Shelley?
Well, I would just say that I think that things really went south when in 2007, 2008, the great financial crisis, when many people in the Chinese Communist Party decided that the West, led by the US, was in terminal decline, and that it was China's opportunity to step forward and begin to occupy more space in the international community. And while I think that they have been shocked to learn that the West is in fact not in terminal decline across all the dimensions, sometimes I feel like the US is in pretty terminal decline. So my advice to the US would be to get your act together. Stop doing stupid stuff that's counterproductive, that makes people in other countries think democracy is not a good system, and become a better country, one that others want to aspire to be like and to follow. Otherwise, you're just giving the game away. And so I think I don't have advice for the PRC government. They don't need my advice. But my advice to every American is stop being such a knucklehead and grow up.
Thank you very much, Shelley. We will pass on that information
Thank you.
to the powers that are in the country. I would like to thank very much all our three speakers for a very insightful and enlightening discussion. Shelley Rigger, we just heard, Kaiser Kuo, and also, of course, John Culver, particularly for John's military and intelligence advice, Shelley for her insights on Taiwan, and Kaiser's insights on geopolitical rivalry between China and the United States and the rest of the world. I would also like to thank Leila and Pete for their great assistance with the questions in particular. And I would like to thank our audience for staying with us for over 2 hours. And most of you did stay with us and listen patiently, and hopefully you all found it very interesting. So thank you again for your contributions, and thank you again for being with us for yet another exciting Krasno event series. And I would like to say that our next event is on September 13th, when General Ben Hodges, the former commanding officer of the US Army in Europe, will talk to us about the military and strategic situation in Ukraine and between Ukraine and the Russian aggressor. That also promises to be a highly interesting event, September 13. Thank you very much tonight to all our three speakers and to the audience. And I wish you a good evening. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.